Peggy Price, my co-chair.
Good evening, and thank you all for joining us. In 1973, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in the case of Roe versus Wade that women had the legal right to choose whether or not to end a pregnancy. Almost 50 years later, that ruling is in jeopardy. The expected overturning of Roe v. Wade not only would undermine a woman's right to choose, but could set the stage for further erosion of our human rights. As a society, we seem to be headed backward. For instance, tonight we'll hear about states that not only are curbing a woman's right to choose, but also are trying to prevent their residents from going out of state for a safe, legal abortion. Happily, New York isn't having it. Tonight, we will hear from two of New York's leading champions of women's rights, who will explain how New York is rising to the challenge and protecting reproductive health care here. Our distinguished speakers include New York State Senator Liz Krueger, New York State Assembly member Rebecca Seawright, and Susan Appleton, a law professor and professor of women, gender, and sexuality at Washington University. Following these presentations, we will take questions from the audience, but let's begin with an overview of the national picture from Professor Susan Appleton. Susan.
Thank you very much. I do have some slides to show, but it says that the host has disabled participant screen sharing. Well,
you have that. You should have that capability now. Go ahead.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. So thanks so much for inviting me. Although my home base is St. Louis, Missouri, I'm actually in a hotel room in Manhattan, which is why you're probably seeing some beds behind me. As we know, the fate of a constitutional right to abortion sits on a knife's edge, and I think we could get a decision any day, maybe even this week, and it doesn't look promising. So I'm going to talk about the national picture, as I've been asked, and the implications of overruling Roe versus Wade, which the court seems poised to do when it decides whether or not to uphold the Mississippi ban on abortions that takes effect 15 weeks after the last menstrual period in the Dobbs case. And because I think the fate of Roe looks so dire, I'm calling this Requiem for Roe. Let's see. So Dobbs was argued back on December 1st of this year, and the leaked draft opinion, which we recently all saw, indicates that there are 5 justices who would overturn Roe outright. And in the meantime, however, the court has let stand a Texas law, which basically has shut down abortions in that state. So that's another ominous sign. I'm going to divide my time into 3 principal parts. I'm going to say a few words about the leaked draft opinion. I'm going to provide a glimpse of developments in the state and on the ground. And then I'll identify some particularly thorny problems likely to arise after Roe. What stood out for me immediately from the leaked draft opinion was the utter contempt for Roe. It says that Roe was remarkably loose in its treatment of constitutional text. It describes Roe's reasoning as extremely weak. We heard more of the same in these oral arguments in the Dobbs case. It's really a caricature of the opinion rather than a close reading. And this was the leaked opinion that came out in Politico. Overlooked were all the nuances and the difficult decisions that Roe confronted, analyzed, and resolved. Now, it's true that even supporters questioned Roe's rationale based on a right to privacy, but in the years since, momentum has been gained by an alternative argument, an argument based on gender equality, that abortion freedom is necessary in order to achieve gender equality. I think it's notable in this draft opinion that the court summarily rejects that. It says that pregnancy-based discrimination is not sex discrimination. discrimination. It rejects arguments based on outmoded stereotypes, arguments that had been very influential in past gender equality cases. And it rejects arguments that if Mississippi really wanted to protect women's health, as it claims that it wants to do, there would be much better ways to do that. Now, the court could uphold the Mississippi 15-week law by overturning Roe, as the leaked draft does, but that's not inevitable. There remains the possibility that something less extreme could emerge. So a majority could eviscerate Roe without explicitly overturning it, claiming to modify or narrow the scope of the right, perhaps presenting a 15-week cutoff as in Mississippi law as a middle ground or a new compromise. And we're told that Chief Justice Roberts prefers that approach. One theory is that the opinion was leaked in order to prevent Justice Kavanaugh from peeling off and joining a more moderate position that Roberts seems to advocate. Some advocates say that the Roberts approach would actually camouflage dramatic change as if it were a moderate step and possibly soften the outrage that would otherwise follow. Most people think that overruling Roe would return abortion to the states, but that's actually not inevitable. Abortion is interstate commerce, and all this traveling people are doing and will do more of, I think, illustrates that. So it's possible Congress could intervene, but as you probably know, the US Senate recently refused to pass the Women's Health Protection Act that would have codified Roe. Congressional authority could work the other way, though. If we had a hostile House and Senate, a nationwide abortion ban could be passed if Roe versus Wade were overruled. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't want to say that Roe and the status quo were perfect. Roe's privacy rationale does nothing to help people who are too poor to exercise their abortion rights. It does nothing to help those who would carry a pregnancy to term if only they had the financial wherewithal for another child. We would need a better safety net for that. But of course, overruling Roe doesn't address those problems either. And overruling Roe completely ignores the very real physical tolls that pregnancy takes on the body. And in fact, there was a New York Times article posted today that talks about the maternal mortality rate, and I've got some data here. In 2018, the maternal mortality ratio was 17.4 deaths per 100 live births, and that's more than double. That's here in the United States of most other high-income countries, and as much as 9 times higher than some, such as New Zealand and Norway. The number has come even higher since then, and it's worth emphasizing that Black individuals are more than 3 times as likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than their white counterparts. So that's an overview based on the leaked draft opinion and the oral arguments. Next, let me turn briefly to some developments on the ground. As you no doubt know, states have ramped up their anti-abortion activity in anticipation of Roe's demise. And you can see the incredibly high number of anti-abortion laws enacted in recent years. We know what states will do. We know which states will outlaw abortion, which states will allow them. Perhaps the most explicit act of defiance has been the Texas law, CB8, with its private cause of action for damages, its bounty hunter approach, and its careful design to avoid pre-enforcement review. In January, the Supreme Court refused to grant mandamus to compel the U.S. Court of Appeals to send the case back to the district court to let it go forward. So even the narrow window the Supreme Court kept open for challenging that law was closed by the court eventually. And in the meantime, the chilling effect of that law has continued, halting almost all abortions in Texas and sending patients out of state. Now, a number of abortion providers have been getting ready. For example, my local Planned Parenthood affiliate in St. Louis, Missouri, where I've long served on the board, opened a satellite office just across the Mississippi River in the more abortion-friendly state of Illinois. And just a couple months ago was the ribbon cutting ceremony for the new Regional Logistics Center, which is specifically designed to to serve out-of-state patients. So abortion travel is something that's happening now, and it's sure to increase once constitutional protection is reduced or eliminated. And I can't get this map to do the interaction, but it shows how far people would have to travel from their home states if those states do not allow abortion. All of this brings me to the third part of my remarks, which I call thorny post-Roe problems. So as Peggy indicated, one problem concerns whether restrictive states can reach beyond their borders to take aim at abortions that their residents obtain elsewhere. And this has long preoccupied me, not only as someone interested in reproductive justice, but also someone who teaches a rather arcane course called Conflict of Laws that studies what law applies when cases or transactions have connections with more than one state. And we've, of course, seen news items from my home state of Missouri, which is trying to stop residents from traveling to Illinois and other states to terminate their pregnancies. At the same time, more hospitable states seeking to become abortion safe havens are proactively beginning to legislate protections for abortions and providers in that state, in their states. And we have action in California, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Michigan, and here in New York. And I'm sure you'll hear from the legislators about the 6 new laws that were recently passed with that protection in mind. But I do have to say, despite those efforts, no state can fully eliminate risks for providers because the dominant approach to choice of law these days is not strictly territorial. It recognizes that states can have policies that apply to their residents even when their residents leave the state. So if a hostile jurisdiction if a hostile state gets jurisdiction over an abortion participant and has an anti-abortion law, and the case is litigated in the hostile state would be free to apply its own law to the controversy. It's enough for a state to have significant contacts with the case, giving rise to state interests in order to apply that state's own law. Now, efforts to regulate extraterritorially could take several forms. They could take the form of a civil cause of action for damages, like that under the Texas law. Some have wondered whether out-of-state conduct that helps Texans obtain abortion would be actionable. Probably not, but that's only because Texas has a presumption against extraterritorial application for its statutes, and there's no specific language in here to override that presumption. But Texas could modify that law, and copycat legislation has been introduced in other jurisdictions that do not have presumptions against extraterritoriality. There could be criminal laws that reach beyond a state's borders as long as the state clearly says so, and as long as there's a policy advanced by the law. The Model Penal Code is a very influential model statute that have influenced a number of states, and this it suggests that that's possible. But even beyond that, criminal laws could take aim at providing aid in, say, Missouri to help a Missouri resident terminate a pregnancy in New York. And if the aid is being provided in Missouri, then Missouri would seem to have that within its authority without controversy. And by way of analogy, several states have laws that make it a crime locally to promote travel for the purposes of prostitution. So what about a statute that would say the same about promoting abortion? Now, many people react, to say, well, states just can't do that. Can they? Aren't there constitutional limits on one state's authority to reach conduct in another? And there are some interesting constitutional possibilities, but the law is very unsettled and we don't know the answer. And that's why to say that you can't eliminate risk altogether is probably the wisest answer. So there could be arguments under the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, the Full Faith and Credit Clause of Article 4 of the Constitution, the Privileges and Immunities Clause of Article 4, the Sixth Amendment Vicinage Clause, which says criminal cases should be tried in the place where the crime is committed. And if the abortion is performed in a state where it's not a crime, then where would you try it? To the extent that counseling is involved, there could be a freedom of speech problem under the First Amendment. There is a right to travel that the court has read into the Privileges or Immunities Clause of the 14th Amendment. And then there's the Dormant Commerce Clause doctrine. Congress has authority over interstate commerce. And as I've mentioned before, abortion is interstate commerce, so states shouldn't be able to interfere with it. Some authorities have opined that state law criminalizing the out-of-state conduct of an abortion provider, that would violate the Commerce Clause, but they also suggest that criminalizing the traveling patient's conduct would not violate the Commerce Clause. But all of this is unsettled. And when I talk about punishing the abortion patient, I think it's worth noting that historically abortion laws have always punished the provider, not the patient. In other words, the gender discrimination that's so infused in abortion laws doesn't even recognize the pregnant woman as an agent, a participant in her own abortion. Even the draconian Texas law has no penalties for the patient. Now, with the rise of self-managed medication abortion, where there's no identifiable abortion provider to punish, we could well see a departure from the traditional exemption of the patient, along with state efforts to regulate in this space. So the bottom line is these are unresolved constitutional questions in any context. And further clarity and development on many of these constitutional constraints could well come from interstate abortion jurisprudence, which would probably be a bad place for it to develop. As one observer noted with respect to the Texas law, we're getting lots of bad procedural rulings in abortion cases simply because the topic is abortion. And the same could be true for resolution of some of these other constitutional questions. Now, I've already alluded to another thorny post-Roe problem. As I noted, medication abortions have increased, so self-managed abortion care will become much more widespread, with medication obtained by mail, even from outside the United States. And this shows the rise of self-managed medication, the rise of medication abortion. So what will that mean in terms of regulation? And more specifically, what will that mean in terms of the target of punitive measures? You might remember famously that Donald Trump, in one of his debates during the 2016 presidential campaign, said that there must be punishment for the abortion patient herself. But then he was forced to walk that back because the party line is that abortion restrictions are designed to help and protect women, not to punish them. In other countries where pregnant women can be prosecuted, data show that the impact falls on poor and minority individuals who present at hospitals when follow-up care is necessary, and the hospital must report them. Their more privileged counterparts see private physicians and escape such reporting. So we'll need to wait and see what the rise of self-managed abortion care will mean in this country. But there are some ominous signs. So for example, the news back in May featured a proposal in Louisiana that would not only classify abortion as homicide, but would also prosecute the woman who ends her pregnancy. Some think that the FDA's authority over drugs could be used to provide a toehold for federal protection and facilitation of medication abortion. But by the same token, the tables could turn with an unfriendly executive branch. The third thorny post-Roe problem concerns what happens to privacy and liberty doctrine more generally, which were the bases of Roe versus Wade. Constitutional protection for use of and access to birth control rest on the same constitutional foundation as Roe. So does protection for sexual autonomy and marriage equality. So can the court pull the plug on the abortion right without affecting these other rights? And as you can see from this slide, there's a doctrinal connection among holdings that use liberty in the Due Process Clause to protect one's right to raise a child as one sees fit, to use birth control to terminate a pregnancy, to engage in private sexual conduct outside marriage and regardless of gender. and then the right to marry regardless of gender. And so the court has gone from one to the next of these, but it's all based on the same doctrine. Can you eliminate one without having everything else collapse? Now, the draft opinion says that abortion poses unique moral questions. But clearly, the opinion's emphasis on the fact that history, tradition, and constitutional text do not support abortion rights explicitly could also doom contraception, marriage equality, and the like. And indeed, with Roe off the books, states or Congress might even legislate fetal personhood. Trigger laws, depending on the phrasing, could apply to certain forms of contraception, like IUDs. I got a question from a law student in my home state of Missouri asking whether she should transfer to another law school because she uses an IUD if Roe versus Wade is overturned. Best practices for miscarriage care could become problematic and already have in some states. And although the Supreme Court has not constitutionalized assisted reproduction like the use of in vitro fertilization, overturning Roe could have dire implications for processes that require the creation, the manipulation, and often the destruction of human embryos here in an effort to start a pregnancy rather than to end one. And then more generally, what happens to gender equality? If the final opinion, like the draft opinion, gets rid of the gender equality argument and rejects the notion that anti-abortion laws reflect archaic stereotypes based on sex, what does that mean for all of the other protections that the court has granted over the years to make sure that gender equality is preserved? So I'm going to stop there and we'll, I guess, hear from others and then have some discussion. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was so informative, Dr. Appleton. We really appreciate your remarks. Our next two speakers represent us in Albany, and as Peggy has said, are very strong proponents of abortion rights for women, and will both discuss the series of bills that were recently passed in Albany to provide an increase of those protections. One of our most vocal proponents of abortion rights in the New York State Senate is our own Liz Krueger, who ably represents our district. Senator Krueger sponsored the 2019 Reproductive Health Act, and this year she sponsored a bill to codify an equality amendment for the state constitution. Liz?
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me tonight. And it was a pleasure to listen to the professor go through the fundamental, very complicated constitutional issues that we are confronting with the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And, you know, she said maybe because of the leak, maybe something will be different than the draft we've seen. I'm not feeling that optimistic. And although, of course, she also pointed out, even if they change it, it might not actually be optimistic in any way for what we're dealing with. So yes, the state of New York is one of those states that has declared itself open to be a sanctuary state for women to come to for their healthcare needs if they are living someplace that will no longer provide fundamental basic healthcare needs, such as access to contraception and the right to contraception, the right to abortion, the right to IVF treatments in order to become pregnant. There are so many different ramifications. I've even read an interpretation that under some of these state laws, women wouldn't be free to choose to have their tubes tied. I always find it fascinating when people, usually men, sorry for the good men who are here listening tonight, it's not an attack on all men, but I do find it fascinating that men who say that abortion is outrageous and can never be allowed also seem to oppose contraception and even the concept that women would have the autonomy over their bodies to choose to have their tubes tied, preventing them from getting pregnant. So there are so many complicated ramifications. So as a state legislator, Rebecca and I are both, Rebecca's in the Assembly, I'm in the Senate. In order to change law in New York State, we all know this, you have to get bills passed both by the Assembly, the Senate, and then signed by the governor. I think the good news for us right now in history is New York is represented by a very pro-choice governor, Kathy Hochul, a very pro-choice Senate, and a very pro-choice Assembly. So that's the good news. That wasn't the storyline. Really, for most of the 50 years Roe existed, New York State passed an abortion law in 1970, pre-Roe v. Wade, but to be honest, it was a terrible law that just stuck some language in our criminal law that said maybe abortion's not a crime all the time. And then we had Roe, and everybody sort of forgot we had a really bad law, and nobody even succeeded in trying to fix it because we then had a conservative Republican majority. Sorry to be partisan. I know committee boards are not partisan, but we had this conservative Senate that would refuse to entertain any improvements or modernization of abortion rights laws in New York. And so I introduced, I think, the Women's Reproductive Health Act with my then colleague and now leader, Andrea Stewart Cousins, in 2007. And it took us till 2019 for us to actually get this on the floor and passed. And even at that time, a couple of years ago, there were people saying, we don't need that. You're just acting like you're worried that something could ever happen to Roe. Nothing can happen to Roe. And we have all these good protections in New York State. And I would point out over and over again, no, actually, look at our laws. We have absolutely zero protections in New York State in our statutes. So we need this law, which does codify into our health statutes pretty much exactly what is in Roe v. Wade. And so I'm very glad that we accomplished that. And it was a huge, huge accomplishment a few years ago, thanks to my colleagues in both houses and the previous governor, which I rarely thank for anything, but we won't talk about him. But he did actually sign that bill. And then we get to this point in history, as Susan was so well drawing out for us. But a lot of us knew this was happening. It was happening over an extended period of time, and it was a strategy to push this into the courts and to push for more and more conservative federal judges, not just on the Supreme Court, but on all those federal courts that cases go through before they get to the Supreme Court. So there were real efforts to make sure that our federal courts were made more conservative, and then also for states, such as the one Susan was talking about, and there are many more. I think there are 26 states with anti-choice laws that have now passed, and I think 13 have trigger laws, 12 or 13 have trigger laws that would immediately pretty much end access to abortion overnight with the end of Roe. And that those states were purposely passing laws that they knew wouldn't stand up in court if Roe stood up, but were purposely trying to get Roe overturned. And it took them quite a while, but that's what they did. And they did it, and I think this is important for us to always remember why all elections matter all the time. They succeeded in getting anti-choice legislatures and governors, not just in red states, so I won't be partisan here. Louisiana has a Democratic governor, a Democratic Senate leader, and I think today they passed or signed some of the worst anti-choice legislation of anywhere in the country, even though I thought Texas and Missouri were sort of tied for the worst. But apparently there are copycat states trying to one-up you all. And so we've really been going the opposite direction now for a decade from where many states were going. And now it'll be incumbent upon us, I absolutely believe this, to make sure that even though, as Susan correctly pointed out, there's a million more questions than there are answers, that we have the strongest laws we believe we can get onto our books as law and ultimately into our Constitution as state constitutional protection rights of women to make their own autonomous decisions over their bodies, over pregnancy outcomes, and to expand on that to recognize that we must also guarantee in our Constitution rights and protections for people who are LGBTQ, for people who fall into all kinds of categories that you and I don't think about every day, but don't have constitutional protections, including being Hispanic in New York doesn't offer you any constitutional protections. It's not a race. We protect race in our Constitution. We don't protect where you came from or the language that might have been your first language as a category of people. We don't protect people who are disabled. We have specific laws that say you can't violate equal protections and privacy and discrimination, but it would take us a couple hundred years to update every individual law to cover everyone. So we do fundamentally need to get into constitutional amendment language, and I don't know whether my time will be up, and maybe I'll just hand it to Rebecca there, but she and I have been working on very hard an attempt to get a constitutional amendment written and passed by both houses of the legislature, but it's a constitutional amendment, so it will have to go through both houses in 2 different sessions and then come to the public for a vote. You don't change New York State's constitution easily. But we did succeed before we left Albany at the end of our regular session a couple of weeks ago. We were successful in passing, I believe somebody already said it, 6 bills that primarily expand New York State's attempt to protect our healthcare providers from interference by other states if they are doing exactly what their medical license and scope of practice categories of healthcare are. So we wanted to make sure that New York State could not cooperate with out-of-state legal cases involving abortion, with very limited exceptions to that. We wanted to make sure we consolidated multiple abortion-related bills into an omnibus proposal for criminal and civil components, making it extremely difficult for other states, even if they conclude we've violated some of their criminal or civil laws, that they aren't going to be able to extradite defendants, whether it's the patient who's still here in New York or our healthcare provider, into their states and their courts. Susan touched on that in her presentation. We also put into our law that we are prohibiting our police from arresting anyone who has performed or aided in the performance of a legal abortion in New York State, even if they're getting a call from a sheriff in Texas going, we know a Texan is in New York, we know they're at such and such Planned Parenthood address, we want you to go in there and arrest those people because they're violating Texas law on a Texas resident. So we made explicit, no, the New York police cannot participate in cooperating with other states' police. And for civil cases, because a lot of these laws end up being civil, also as Susan pointed out, that New York courts are not going to be honoring subpoenas from courts in other states on civil issues related to abortion services. That's just all one bill that I sponsored. All those pieces got sort of merged into one bill. We also passed a bill on freedom from interference with reproductive health advocacy and the exercise of travel. So glad Susan also touched on this, because to be honest, we're not so sure how much our state law would stand up to a federal challenge. We just don't know, but we're going to give it a try so that patients can talk to healthcare providers here and then come to New York to get services, and that we're going to do everything we can to make sure that her rights to travel to our state to get healthcare services not interrupted by her home state, or frankly any other state, because Susan showed you that map. Some people are going to need to travel across many state lines that are not friendly to abortion rights in order to get to a state like ours or California or Illinois, et cetera. And so even as absurd a conversation, and I've had a lot of them now, you're flying over Texas. The plane malfunctions, they have an emergency landing. You're a New York State licensed OB-GYN who does perform abortions. And now you're in Texas, not by choice, but by necessity. And they scoop you up and say, you broke our laws, we know it, we can prove it, you're a felon, you're going to jail. So crazy things like, are you going to be able to cross the country comfortably after these laws go into effect? We're still not 100% sure. We also passed a law that they can't go after your malpractice coverage rights protections as a provider. They can't go through a medical process, review process to argue misconduct charges for performing any health activity in New York that's within your what we call licensed scope of practice. We tried to strengthen our confidentiality laws so that healthcare providers who aren't really paranoid if they think somebody might be coming after them, but that our healthcare providers would be able to access similar systems that victims of domestic violence and people who have had stalkers and have gotten caught up in human trafficking, that they have special rights under our laws to change their identity and addresses, etc., to protect their privacy. So we've applied those standards as well to providers of these services. And we also did one more bill relating to studying what I call the fake reproductive health centers that have been set up all over this country and certainly all over the state, where they advertise that you should come to them for counseling and services and healthcare services if you're pregnant. And you think perhaps it's sort of like a Planned Parenthood site, and then you get there and discover that they will do anything to prevent you from having an abortion. And so we want to investigate what their practices are so that we can better work to regulate what's allowed and not allowed in New York. And I don't know whether I went on too long, and I just touched on the constitutional amendment. So maybe I will, if I can, just hand that back to Rebecca now, unless you want me to go into more detail.
No, that's great. Thank you so much. You had a lot to say, and I know a lot more because you've done so much. So we definitely appreciate all of your efforts on our behalf. And as you said, our next speaker is Assemblywoman Rebecca Seawright, who we're also fortunate to have represent us in Albany in the New York State Assembly. And she's a very strong progressive champion who fights for all types of women's rights, including certainly rights for reproductive freedom. Assemblywoman Seawright actually sponsored a companion assembly bill to Senator Kruger's, including a person's pregnancy, creed, and religion among the protections from discrimination. With that said, Rebecca, we look forward to your remarks.
Well, thank you, Gail and Peggy, the co-chairs, for hosting this very important panel tonight and timely discussion for Community Board 8. It's great to see so many dear friends on, and I see Vanessa Aronson has her little one on. It's great to see kids on the Zoom this evening. And I want to thank our state senator. Not only is she our state senator for the Upper East Side and Roosevelt Island, will be, she's also the finance chair, which is one of the most important positions in Albany. And in addition to that, she is co-chair of the bipartisan pro-choice legislative caucus and has done a phenomenal job in hosting Zoom sessions with for the men and women legislators to understand what the issues are. So I can't thank Senator Liz Krueger enough, and how honored I am to have her as my senator. And it was great to hear Law Professor Susan Appleton this evening. Thank you for all of your expertise and being here to share it with us. It's a privilege to hear from you tonight. And I'd like to focus my remarks on 3 issues. What's likely to happen, which you've heard, which is the overturning of Roe v. Wade. How did it happen? And where do we go from here? So to start off, the question on what happened. It's a travesty that access to reproductive health care rights, including the right to abortion care, is not deemed a fundamental health care right across our nation. Reproductive health care is under attack and greatly endangered. Poll after poll shows that the majority of Americans support the reproductive right of abortion as a result of the Roe decision. This will be the first time in United States history that a constitutional right has actually been taken away. Abortion access is essential, a common medical intervention, and 1/4 of the women in our country will need access to abortion care in their lifetime. And as you've heard earlier this evening, states across the nation are at this moment deciding to revoke or severely restrict the rights of women to obtain a safe abortion. It's been 294 days since Texas women were barred from having a safe abortion. States are working on trigger or copycat legislation that puts a bounty on women, with lawsuits awarding $10,000 to those who report patients and those aiding and abetting abortion care. And let's be clear, women are still going to have abortions. Where abortion is illegal or highly restricted, pregnant women can resort to unsafe means to end an unwanted pregnancy, including self-inflicted trauma, ingestion of dangerous chemicals, and reliance on unqualified providers. Women must be encouraged to tell their personal stories. The majority of abortion patients are minorities and are living below the federal poverty level. We are punishing minority women and women who have no means of obtaining a safe abortion by traveling to a safe haven state like New York. And we must not forget that people of all genders have sexual and reproductive health needs, including women, transgender individuals, non-binary individuals, and those who are otherwise gender diverse. Before Roe in 1973, approximately 800,000 US women resorted to illegal abortion each year. New York State has codified reproductive health care and access to abortion. However, we cannot take this Reproductive Health Act for granted. It's only written in statute and can be overturned with a new legislators, and a new majority in the state legislature. So in response to the alarming national trends, our New York State legislature can strengthen current laws and work to expand access to reproductive health services, including safe and legal abortion, to impacted New Yorkers and those coming from out of state. And as Senator Krueger stated earlier, we attended a bill signing of the 6 bills, and it's great that we have a woman governor who was supportive and signed these 6 bills so quickly after they passed. And as Senator Krueger stated, we both sponsored the Equality Amendment in the Assembly and the Senate, and will continue to work for its passage. Now to answer the question, how did this happen? Many feel that Karl Rove has been strategizing for years to get people of a certain conservative party elected and conservative Supreme Court justices appointed. It's going to be up to our young people to change this result. The 1960s gave rise to abortion law reform. In the late 1960s, 11 states liberalized their abortion laws, and in 1973, the Supreme Court established the legal right to access to abortion nationwide with its landmark decision in Roe v. Wade. My former employer and mentor, Sarah Weddington, was actually in Albany in 2019 when Senator Kruger codified Roe v. Wade into New York state law. And unfortunately, she passed away, and I was asked to speak at her funeral a few months ago in Texas at the state cemetery. And I'm so glad that she's not around to see what's happening to that case. We're living in an extremely volatile federal climate, a movement in time marked by actions to roll back fundamental freedoms and to exert control over the most vulnerable among us. Other rights that are not explicitly named in the US Constitution, including the right to contraception, interracial marriage, same-sex marriage, LGBTQIA rights, voting rights, and more, are all under attack. Our identities and our rights, we must fight for them and be unrelenting in the face of a hostile Supreme Court and federal government. In New York, we are also directing $35 million to an abortion services provider fund. $25 million will be used to expand abortion services already present in New York, and $10 million will be used to protect abortion clinics. I'm sure many of you were interested enough to join this program tonight, understand that we have to be in this fight for the long haul. We have to mobilize the younger generation of women to have the same passion as the generation before them, to fight for what we thought were our freedoms. I heard Planned Parenthood's former president, Cecile Richards, this week speak, and she shared the idea to get every college campus to have a paid organizer for reproductive rights, and for people to tell their stories and to have a mutual place online where people can post their personal stories. We must get mad. We must organize. Abortion is just one issue weaponized against women. Our cause has not been more just, more important, and more necessary than this moment in history. And in the words of the Roe v. Wade attorney, Sarah Weddington, we stand taller because we stand on the women who went before us, who fought for this right. So thank you all again for tuning in this evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that presentation. Before we get to questions, which we're about to do, I just want to see if Senator Kruger could expand a little bit on the status of the proposed constitutional amendment. For example, there had been talk that there might be a special session this summer in Albany to address that. Could you tell us where things stand with this possible constitutional amendment?
So happily, Rebecca and I now have a same as version in both the Senate and the Assembly, but we have counsel and leadership who may not be in 100% agreement with each of us or with this language. So we are struggling still. I know there was actually another meeting I had asked to be coordinated with some constitutional attorneys this afternoon to try to work out more issues. I think when we started this, there was like maybe 5 major issues nobody could agree on, and now we're down to 1. I'm crossing my fingers, Rebecca, it's just that one. We're sticking with that one.
Yes.
That 5. So we got from 5 problems to 1 problem.
Our fingers crossed.
But it is actually, thank you, Peggy, it is sort of crucial, if we can, to get agreement and bring this to the floor before July 9th, I believe is the deadline date, because in New York state law, I told you, changing our constitution is a complicated exercise. You have to get it through both houses, 2 sessions. Our session will end in December, but there's another law somewhere that says for constitutional amendments, you got to get first passage before July 9th or before X number of dates before you're going to have your election. So we have a couple of weeks left, and I'm just not sure we can get to the agreement and then actually be in Albany to vote it through in both houses, because it will require what's referred to as an extraordinary session called by the governor, where she sets the agenda of what bills will come to the floor. to have this happen and be voted on. So even though the governor doesn't sign constitutional amendment resolutions, she has a very, very important role in pushing to see if we can all get this done in a very quick timeline. Now, we also may have to go back in that same time frame to deal with another horrendous Supreme Court decision we are expecting to come down in the next couple of days. And that is a Supreme Court decision that would rule New York City's gun permit laws to be unconstitutional, basically opening up New York City to have no rules about people wanting to carry guns with them around the 5 boroughs. Because you just didn't wake up this morning thinking that was the best damn idea ever to turn New York City into Texas for gun laws. Thank you. We are having our own violence problems here with illegal guns coming in from all over the country and people making ghost guns on printing machines. And New York City has had probably the strongest gun control laws of anywhere in the country as far as carrying guns through outside of your home. And so, but the Supreme Court, we believe, is absolutely going to overrule that law. And we believe we may have to rush back to Albany to very creatively draft new laws that dance around that Supreme Court decision, at least for a few years. And then the gun lobby will probably bring it into federal courts that are more conservative courts, and we'll end up back in the Supreme Court again someday. But we might be able to hold on to our gun law protections for another bunch of years. And we're sort of playing in a very weird way, and I don't know what the law professor would describe it as. I feel like I'm playing whack-a-mole with the Supreme Court. Like, what are we going to try to do right for the people of our states or country? Then what is the Supreme Court going to decide to do to knock our laws out? And then how creative can we get at getting around them by passing different laws and seeing how long we can play this bizarre game of chicken, in my opinion, until we actually get a different Supreme Court in place, which could be, I'm very hesitant to say, a very, very long time. Although Congress could add numbers of members to the Supreme Court, which is another community board discussion we could have. And Susan might want to participate in that one also as a constitutional law expert. But I don't think you have time for that one tonight. So that's
Thank you so much. Certainly, these issues are so complex, and we have a lot of people who would love to ask questions of our outstanding panel. And we're going to start with Erica. Could you please unmute Erica?
Thank you. So I just want to thank our representatives for being here tonight. And Liz Kruger, I would say it is like a game of whack-a-mole because a majority of the Supreme Court justices are basically like clowns at the carnival. So that's one. Dr. Appleton, I have a question and actually more of a clarification. Can you briefly talk about, or briefly when it comes to the Constitution, talk about how Justice Ginsburg would talk about how abortion rights were created versus how she thought they should have been created? I hope I'm asking that correctly.
Would you unmute, please unmute Dr. Appleton?
There, I tried to do it myself, but I couldn't. Thank you. So Justice Ginsburg wrote at a time that she thought that states were starting to modernize their abortion laws, and that maybe there would have been a less hostile reaction, less backlash if it hadn't been judicially imposed. But I think a lot of historians have taken a close look and determined that this wasn't a sort of natural backlash. And it wasn't even that all religious groups certainly opposed abortion rights or helped mobilize opposition. to abortion rights, but that it was a studied political move of trying to unite various conservative voters who otherwise didn't have anything in common. And so I'm not sure that Justice Ginsburg, with whom I agreed on many things, was right, that the court, by speeding up the process of reform, somehow caused opposition to it.
Because she said that a few times throughout her career.
She did.
So I've always been curious about that.
Well, she thought states like New York. Now, Senator Kruger suggested that New York's law in the early 70s really wasn't a helpful law, or as helpful as it could have been in any event. But there was some legislative movement, and the American Law Institute's Model Penal Code, where I showed you the jurisdictional provision, also had a proposal that would have eliminated restrictions on some abortions, but didn't go as far as Roe versus Wade would have. So it listed conditions under which abortion would not be criminal, but it had lots of hoops for the patient to jump through, including getting a board of physicians to say that her reason for an abortion was a good reason. And so it would have taken much more time. But, that's where we are now. I think today, if the court does undo Roe versus Wade, then the solutions will have to be legislative. And voters will have to elect legislators who will try to achieve those goals.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Lori, could you unmute Lori Boris, please?
Yes, thank you. First off, I want to thank Peggy and Gail for having this meeting, because I remember a time not too long ago when we on the community board were told we're not going to discuss abortion. So thank you for bringing it up. I also want to talk about the 52% of women who get abortions, even today, who are already mothers. Including in that group is my grandmother, who had 3 children. And when she got pregnant with the 4th in 1943, she borrowed $250, which was an outrageous amount of money, and went to an abortionist. I don't know too much about him or her. And she died like 2 weeks later, causing horror in the family. My mother, to this day, was raised without her real mother. And I was the person who discovered all of this history, because in an Italian Catholic family, you don't talk about these things. So my mother was just, the word was, she died from like eating poison mushrooms, or she died, it's just horrible. The whole thing is horrible. And I won't even go into details about that. But anyway, I will show you that this is a picture of her gravestone, which I bring to all protests about abortion these days. It's like, so anyway, that's that. But anyway, to my questions. This is a very emotional topic for me, so pardon me if I can't get the words out. But my first question to Dr. Appleton is, if we had the ERA, would that make a difference? Would that help, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know the specifics of it, but if we had passed the ERA in all 50 states, would that make a difference?
That's an excellent question. And I don't think there is a definitive answer. Those states that do have state ERAs have been more supportive of abortion and even publicly funded abortions than states without them. But I think in the hands of a Supreme Court like the one we have now, it might not make any difference, because they're willing to overrule past precedents when it's convenient. And the leaked opinion goes out of its way to say that abortion is different from everything else, that this is not discrimination against women, because on the one side of the line, we have people who are pregnant, and though that it's true, those are only women. But on the other side of the classification, we have a mix of men and women, and therefore it's not a line drawn on the basis of sex. So if the Equal Rights Amendment is about sex discrimination, a court like the one we have now could rationalize that abortion restrictions do not reflect a classification based on sex.
But only women get pregnant. I mean, doesn't
Well,
that...
and actually that's an interesting matter of debate in terms of terminology now, because as one of the other speakers indicated, we do want to be more inclusive. We want to include non-binary people. We want to include trans men who might need pregnancy or abortion services. And I almost feel as if the draft opinion went out of its way to use that to harm the cause of reproductive freedom by saying, because non-pregnant people can be both men and women, it's not sex discrimination. And it invoked precedent that has been much criticized. I think the Geduldig opinion, which said that an employment insurance contract that covered all disabilities that workers might have, except those based on pregnancy, was not a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. It was a state policy, state employer, because the line was not drawn strictly on the basis of sex. So while it's going to overrule Roe versus Wade, it's going to adhere to this very controversial Geduldig opinion to say that pregnancy-based discrimination and therefore abortion restrictions are not sex-based.
And Lori, it's why Rebecca and I are so focused on making sure that the language we put into the New York State Constitution does go significantly farther than the federal efforts, which again started almost 50 years ago. So we've all learned a lot since then. So we're trying to make it very clear in the New York State Constitution that it is, yes, sex discrimination is forbidden, but also discrimination based on someone's decision about a pregnancy outcome, whether it is to end their pregnancy or to continue their pregnancy, that also must be protected. And we go into more detail because the federal effort, which was global and shockingly radical for its time, all we were saying was add women to the Constitution. We're still fighting about it 50 years ago. We were pretty sure that wasn't going to do much in a court case in New York State involving the kinds of issues that we confront now, and people lose in court. Even if we have some good statutes, they end up losing in court because our Constitution isn't broad enough to cover all the issues that we're facing today. And I'm sorry for your grandmother, but I really appreciate your being willing to tell your family story, because you're 100% right, of course, about all of it, and including the fact that most women who have abortions in this country already are mothers of 2 children. So this fantasy out there that these are women who, just didn't feel like using birth control or changed my favorite line is, she wanted to wear the blue dress and realized she didn't look good in it as pregnant, so she decided to have an abortion. Yes, thank you. That these are real life issues every day for women. All of us know, whether we talk about it in our lives, in our family lives or not, it has affected every single one of our families, because it has affected women throughout history. No one's, regardless of what your religion teaches you, a lot of times people don't choose to follow what their religion is telling them when they're facing a life crisis. And we know that, of course, also. So I really appreciate people who are willing to come forward to talk about it. Today, the New York State's Commissioner of Health, named Mary Bassett, she's a fabulous public health doctor. She wrote an op-ed saying, if I hadn't had an abortion, I would never have ended up a doctor and never ended up New York State's highest doctor. So that, I don't remember which newspaper that was in today. Mary Bassett, very impressive woman.
Yeah, there's no question that the decision to have a child or not is the most significant decision a woman can make for her life. I mean, there's no question about that. So, all right, too many other questions. I don't want to monopolize this conversation, but I have two other questions. One is if doctors were to perform abortions in New York State, and then would want to travel. I don't know why they would want to travel to states where they don't, approve of abortion. But would they be subject to arrest if they travel to those states?
Well, they certainly couldn't be providing services in those states,
right?
Because they're only licensed to provide services in New York State. And those other states that are outlawing it would never allow them approval to perform abortions in their states. But yes, we are very concerned that the way any number of the states have written their laws, Texas as the, I think, prime example, somebody would come and scoop you up and say, you violated our laws on our resident of Texas, even though she went to New York for the care. And we're now going to put you on trial here. And nobody really knows what the storylines will be because nobody's done this yet. It's all on the verge of no longer hypothetical, literally on the momentary verge, but it's all new. But I will reference something that someone told me I had to go back and read my history about. It was called the Escaped Slave Act from before the Civil War, where we had states that allowed slavery and states that didn't allow slavery. And slaves were escaping the southern states and coming to states like ours and trying to function as free human beings because we didn't recognize slavery. But if their owner and or the police from the pro-slavery state decided to cross state lines, find them under the Federal Escaped Slave Act, they in theory had the right to take them back to that state or kill them right there since they were property and could be killed. And there were literally shootouts between the police and sheriffs of free states and slave states. And I was like, why are you making me read this? I was like, oh my God, of course I understand why somebody's making me reread this. Because this is awfully parallel to the situation we may all soon find ourselves in.
And I could just interject. You asked, why would someone want to travel through a hostile state? Well, for example, some of the physicians who perform abortions in Illinois actually live in Missouri. It's a metropolitan area that spans 2 states. So they may live in a hostile state, but practice medicine in a permissive state.
Okay, and here's my last question. I've been doing a lot of research and watching films about the Janes in Chicago, who set up their own abortion clinic and, ways to do abortions, which were just incredibly difficult and complicated, but it was a great service that they provided. If that were to develop again, is there any way that I don't know how to say like, could they get away with it is what I'm asking. It's like, if they called it like something other than a term, a pregnancy termination, if they called it like a DNC or, which is what they used to call it, way back when, would that make a difference, or would it still be that they would be, subject to the laws of the other states? I'm sorry if I'm not being clear.
No, we're trying to do the strongest protection laws we can in our state, and we've been working with legislators from a variety of states around the country to all try to compare notes and try to get the language right and make our protections as strong as possible. but I don't know that we all have the storylines yet or the answers. I will say to Dr. Appleton, I bet a bunch of your providers are moving out of Missouri
Yeah.
into Illinois any day.
Yeah.
That would be my answer. Illinois is a great state. I spent 7 years of my life there. They'll like Illinois.
And maybe that's what patients have to do too, is move.
Yeah. Yeah.
Vote with
Well,
their
thank
feet.
you very much.
Thank you, Lori. Can we please unmute Alita?
Thank you. And like everyone else, I'd like to echo thanks for Gail and Peggy for putting this together, and to our esteemed and knowledgeable speakers for spending your evening illuminating this horrible set of facts for us. So thank you. So I have a few questions. One is, how intrusive could states be when it comes to miscarriage? Miscarriage is really painful for people. I read someplace that someone was threatened with a jail sentence because she had a miscarriage. How much can they investigate that? I'll just ask my questions and you can answer them if you like or not. The other one is, I don't really understand conflicts of law. I did go to law school, but I didn't take that class. And the one example I could think of is motorcycle helmet laws. There's a fine involved if you don't wear a helmet. So that makes it not a civil proceeding by the state, I would guess. If the state has an interest in ensuring that its motorcycle riders wear helmets and they're in a state that does not have a helmet law and get into an accident, that the state with the law can't intrude and go into the other state and fine them for not wearing a helmet. So I don't understand how they could attack providers in other states for providing abortion to out-of-state people. Then if someone were to start a GoFundMe campaign to help women who without economic means leave restrictive states and go into progressive states, could that person who starts or anyone who contributes to a GoFundMe campaign, for instance, be subjected to a restrictive state's penalties? And then last, I'd like to remind people, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there is often or usually no exception for rape and incest, and 43 states, the last I researched, have presumptive parental rights for rapists, which is horrifying. So this is just a way to keep women really subjugated to men, barefoot, pregnant, in the kitchen, that kind of thing. And for men who will be able to assert parental rights, because women can't get abortions if they are a victim of a crime like that. It is just a horrifying thought. So those are my questions and comments, and thank you again.
So I could take two of them, but
Great, thank you.
So on the conflict of laws one with the helmet, I mean, there are many situations where states could have tried to reach out beyond their borders. They simply didn't do it. So, back in the day when you could only gamble in Nevada, states that didn't allow gambling protected their residents from squandering their money, but they didn't bother to care whether they went somewhere else to do it. The problem with abortion is the states care enough to try to do this. I've also seen the same situation debated in the surrogacy context. I know surrogacy has been legalized in New York now, but there was a lot of travel there, and many people predicted that states that restricted surrogacy would try to extend those laws beyond state lines, but they simply didn't do it. And so this might be the place where that authority is put to the test, and we'll get some answers, but we don't know what the answers are going to be. And then in terms of miscarriage, the problem as I see it is that it really chills the activities of physicians who might want to provide a particular kind of care, but are afraid that if it crosses the line, they could be in trouble. And so they don't do it. So it's not so much what the law says specifically about miscarriage. It's that if the law says that embryonic life is a person and that you could be guilty of homicide if you end embryonic life, that could dissuade a physician faced with a miscarriage situation from doing what that provider would otherwise do in the absence of that law to play it safe. So I think it's the chilling effect more than the direct regulation of miscarriage treatment.
And doctors also tend to doctors who have hospital privileges, which would be the ones more likely to be involved with more complex medical issues and abortions, they have to follow the hospital's rules. And it's very, very clear, even from New York State pre-2019, because our laws were so bad, there were hospitals all over the state that would refuse to give doctors privileges to perform later in pregnancy abortions because they weren't really sure about the gray area in New York state law, and they were worried about liability for the hospital and medical violations, medical insurance violations. And so there were women who had to leave New York State to search for abortions as late as 2018 in other states, and multiple of them died because it took too long to get to a doctor in one of the 3 states that they could get a later term abortion in. And they were usually the storyline. Their own doctor here in New York said, "You're going to die if you continue this pregnancy. You won't have a viable birth, but you also have a really good chance of dying. This needs to be ended." And then they couldn't find a hospital. Amazingly, in New York City, where we have every hospital, they wouldn't find a hospital that would allow them to perform these procedures, and they would have to travel. The closest state was Maryland. And so we know of women who died traveling to Maryland and Colorado up until we changed our law in 2019. So I think that Susan's point that the chilling effect, particularly in larger institutional settings where most of us do get our health care, is a major component to this that we have to factor in.
I just have a follow-up question about that, which is how far can this go? There are conditions that affect pregnancy where you are ordered on bed rest or told not to eat certain things. If you don't do it once and you have a miscarriage, or you don't follow your doctor's orders and the baby is at risk, can you be prosecuted for that? I mean, the way this could extend in the states that are writing laws about IUDs and writing laws about all, it's just, I mean, I don't really expect that you would answer that, but it's just a horrifying chain of potential events that are not even in the name of religion that, as was pointed out, that everyone subscribes to. So I don't know. It's just, it really, I guess, could keep a lot of people up at night. So thank you.
Well, some people like horror movies, and I read these laws that are coming out of these states. And I mean, again, Dr. Appleton, I haven't never met you before tonight, and I have the highest respect for you, but you come from this state with really crazy people in your chambers. So there's a law that I don't think did pass yet in Missouri that would just say that for a doctor to go in and end an ectopic pregnancy would be a felony.
You are correct.
Felony. Everyone who's ever dealt with pregnancy actually understands an ectopic pregnancy is a pregnancy outside of your womb. It will never successfully be a birth of a child, and it's very likely to kill you if somebody doesn't go and take care of that. So the brilliant people in the state of Missouri elected at least one lunatic in your assembly or senate, I can't remember which, who thought it would just be a grand old idea to add ectopic pregnancies to the list of abortion-like procedures. So
I can't disagree with you. I think it showed the ignorance of the people passing these laws. They don't know nothing about them, but it's an opportunity for political grandstanding.
Thank you very much. Can we please unmute Valerie?
Thanks, everybody. I just want to applaud the efforts of our state senator and assemblywoman to take this opportunity to strengthen as best we can our own laws protecting these rights. I don't know, this has been a frustration of mine for many, many years. You know, we're trying to protect a right that we've had for 50 years while we've sat on the sideline for 49 3/4 of the time. And you're fighting against people who have been fighting, literally, who have seen this issue and have been fighting since the moment that Roe v. Wade decision was announced. And they had an incredible effort that went across 50 states. Not only did they understand that every election since Roe v. Wade has been all about the judges, they went about and captured almost every single state legislature in this country, such that even though more than 70% of all Americans support this right, it's not reflected in every state. I had an opportunity to meet the woman who took over the Tiller Clinic in Kansas after he was murdered. And I mean, when you talk about courage and bravery, this woman's life is in danger every single day. And another, people don't go out and think, we've all heard this, one of the discouraging things is there's not a lot of young women on this Zoom tonight. And one of the things that you've always heard about is, when I was young, people say, oh, you use abortion as a method of birth control. Well, that is the most stupid argument, but it's still being promoted all across the country. And as long as abortion has been legal in this country, the actual numbers of abortion have gone down because people have become more educated about contraceptive, et cetera. I will say that just a couple of points, and then I actually have a question or just maybe something to focus on, which I think affects this debate. There was an opinion piece in the New York Times recently by Michelle Goldberg, and the title of it was "The Future Isn't Female Anymore." And this is, I think, a phenomenal piece. And I just want to quote two statistics. She doesn't quote all the statistics, but essentially, 46% of Democratic men think that feminism has done a disservice to the nation. And those are Democratic men. The numbers for Republicans are even worse. And the same can be said about women, young women, and the effect that they think that feminism has had. So something has really gone wrong in the discourse. And I don't think our panel can answer that question. But I think it's something we have to look at, and that, for many of us in our careers and things that we've done, have been fighting a struggle overtly and quietly at the same time to move towards a more gender equal world. And I can just say for myself that having practiced law for almost 40 years, I don't see it. I don't see it. And I think the younger women are fooling themselves that they see it. I mean, it is getting better, but it's only gotten better perceptively in the last maybe 5-6 years of my career. So I can just say it from that point of view. In terms of abortion, we're still so far behind, and it is a state's issue. And one of the problems, I think, is, and this goes to so many different issues, women these days, of the abortions that are being performed later in the pregnancy, because the people who are having these abortions, they don't even realize that they're pregnant until, part of the Roe v. Wade and the Mississippi statute, and the big argument was, is it 6 weeks gestation? Is it 5 weeks gestation? We have multiple women on the court now, and there's, a woman doesn't even go for a pregnancy test until she's 8 to 10 weeks out. And the laws are basically saying you lose the right to abortion at 6 weeks. So we can't even get women on the court to agree as to what a reasonable period of time is. And we're seeing more and more that abortions are happening later. And also that hurts the argument about abortion, because, you say, oh, what's the time limit? And so people are thinking, oh, you're really ending the life, not of a fetus, but of a viable person. And I think that's something that also has to be explored. But anyway, the question a question that is an everyday question, which isn't addressed by all the great statutes that are being put forward. And I don't think we're really going to know a lot of the answers to these questions until these laws are actually in place and all the lawsuits start. I mean, it is going to be a feeding frenzy for lawyers. I can just tell you that everybody's just waiting for the battle to be engaged, to start. And it's going to take years for these cases to go through. And in the meantime, women are going to suffer. And the only women who are really going to suffer are poor women, because rich women have always been entitled to an abortion because money will buy you that right. And so we're really talking about even about a smaller population. But I can tell you that in the city of New York, there are a lot of buildings that do not allow an OBGYN to have a lease if she agrees to perform abortions. And I don't think that there's any law out there in New York City or New York State that prevents that from being put in a lease. So I would put that out there as just a small thing that can be done to ensure that somebody doesn't have to go to a hospital if they actually find out that they're pregnant and can have an abortion in an office procedure. I know that my OBGYN could not perform abortions where she was located, and she was actually on the Upper East Side because the fear was that there would be protests outside the building. And so again, even the small limitation, I don't know about other cities in New York, but I'm sure if in the most advanced, one of the most pro-choice states, this can happen, I'm sure it's even worse other places. So I would just ask maybe that you guys could look at that and encourage city council and other jurisdictions in New York to take a look at that as a basic right. And just want to say thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you. We'll absolutely look into that question about real estate contract law. You end up going into lease law and contract law, things like that, but we'll definitely look into that, Valerie. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And can we unmute Rita Popper, please?
Thank you so much. This has been fantastic. And Dr. Appleton, I am the proud grandmother of a just recent Washington University graduate. Was a boy.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I feel all of the things that everybody has said, and in my heart, I really think that religion is driving this, even though we're not supposed, we're supposed to be even for everybody, we are not. What about the financial implications for a woman who can't get an abortion, wants an abortion because the guy skipped town, or he's not going to do anything. He's not. What can we do to make sure that she is financially whole and that child is taken care of? Or we end up back in the family courts and we end up with homeless parents with children. And it's like a vicious cycle that we just never, ever stop. And I never hear that that's a part of the play, the financial part, that a man has to do. She can get pregnant by herself. What is the financial part for him? And do we have any? I know, look, I'm a writer. My imagination is, that we should charge $1 bazillion for Viagra. And then if we can't do that, every man who has 2 children has to have a vasectomy. But there's nothing, we are second-class citizens, but we're second-class citizens in the courts. If you take a man's court for financial, that you need financial help, there's nothing that says he has to do it. What do the states say that they will do for this child who is born to one parent? Has anybody?
Yes, so I can answer that. So back at the time of Roe versus Wade, unmarried fathers weren't even recognized as parents with any obligations in some states. But the Supreme Court actually changed that, and that was part of its embrace of gender equality. And actually, there are fairly robust laws of and federal incentives for states to identify fathers and to require them to pay child support. The story doesn't usually have a happy ending. I mean, it's sometimes there simply aren't enough funds, but they're pretty rigorous requirements about keeping support private, and that means looking to the second parent of the child rather than looking towards the state.
Although, Susan, I will add that when you look at the data, the states that do the worst job at child support through paternity challenges and through social welfare policies are the exact same states that are trying to do away
Yes.
with any abortion rights and protection. So
yes,
those red states with large numbers of low-income people, women of color, who are going to get the double penalty if they aren't successful at getting the healthcare services they need, and end up with children they did not plan for or wish to have. Those aren't the states that are generous or effective at getting them the resources. So
no, and that's what I meant when I said the story doesn't have a happy ending. I mean,
yeah.
there are laws on the books, but you're right about the data.
Right.
Thank you to my elected officials and for Dr. Appleton. But it seems to me that we are enlarging the amount of people who cannot afford their children on their own, and we are having more homeless people, homeless families. We have the largest amount of homeless children in the United States. And
so as Justice Amy Coney Barrett said during the oral arguments, well, then babies should just be abandoned at safe haven sites so they can be adopted. That was her solution to the problem.
It's hard to believe that I'm living in such a democratic country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Alita, do you have another question? Okay, so I'll take Alita and then Lori, and then I have a question.
Thank you, Peggy. The question is not so much about women, but about science and whether we're moving backwards. And I don't know the answer to this. And I think under George Bush Younger that something happened with it, which is the ability to use fetal cells or blood for scientific research. So what the impact of this would have on the ability to find cures and do other things involving science, if you don't mind answering that.
So during the Bush administration, they did outlaw the use of stem cells for research purposes. And so they didn't outlaw it, they came and arrested our scientists, but you could not draw down any federal funds for your research if you were using stem cells, because of the belief, which was, by the way, factual, that the most common ways to get stem cells for research purposes was to get donations from families who were using IVF to attempt to get pregnant. And if you're familiar with that model, you always end up with extra fertilized eggs that you're never going to use for a pregnancy. It's just part of the process. And so the IVF sites were usually at that time hospital-based, not private companies. Now they're more private companies, would say, are you willing to allow us to use unused fertilized cells to use for medical research, for stem cell research? And many people would say yes. They actually thought that was a a good goal to support scientific research. And then that turned into this whole, oh my God, they're going and aborting infants because they're stealing their cells, which of course was never the storyline, but became the horror movie storyline that, women were being dragged off streets and pregnancies were being ripped from their womb unsolicited because somebody needed their cells for research. And so Bush actually outlawed it. States could choose to use their own money to support their own research. New York State at the time created a $3 billion fund to support stem cell research in our state. And many of the great institutions right here in Community Board 8 were participating in that kind of research with state money until Bush left and the feds reversed themselves. So now the question is, in states that have passed certain kinds of these laws, will there be even the allowance for in vitro fertilization services? Because pretty much anytime you're involved with in vitro services to help families get pregnant and carry to birth, you end up with fertilized eggs that will never be used. And in certain states, the argument is that that will be defined as abortion and a felony, potential felony, and that nobody who's in the research world will want to go near doing their research in those states or using stem cells that came from these outcomes, which is pretty much mostly still how they are using stem cells. They've advanced since then, and apparently now they can take stem cells from stomach linings. And I know I was at Rockefeller University one day, and they were showing me a project where they were actually making stem cells from scratch in one of their labs. They're sort of a fascinating, brilliant group of people, but they have like bunnies that glow green if you go to their labs, and you get a little nervous. Why is that bunny glowing green? And they merged it with, they merged a glowing octopus with a bunny, and you get a green bunny. But they are actually producing their own stem cells. So it's still a really tough question what some of these state laws will do. But I do think that science is advancing enough that I don't think it's going to end all stem cell research the way it almost did during the Bush era.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. I think we haven't heard from Sherry Weiner yet. So if we can hear from Sherry, and then Lori, and then Peggy has a question.
Thank you. Aren't we lucky in the Upper East Side to be represented by all these women, our senator, our assembly person, and our congresswoman? How lucky are we that they're advocating for us? My question regards medical abortions. As we've heard, medical abortions are now the most prevalent way people are getting abortions. So my question is to whomever, how are they regulated? If Roe v. Wade is overturned, are medical abortions can fall under that? Or do they have to be permitted? I just don't understand. And then the state to state, if you have to mail them, I just would and I mean, it would seem to be a solution if a woman is in, wherever, and she can't, Oklahoma, and can't go to a facility to get it. If she could do a medical abortion, then she doesn't have to drive hours. So I'm a little confused why that is not being promoted for those women who cannot go to a facility to have an abortion. That's my question.
It's being widely discussed. I'm part of a group of state legislators from about 10 states who were asked by the White House to coordinate with them. And this has been a major theme of our discussions, because none of us feel as individual states that we can pass laws that are really going to expand access to these two pills that are, used for medical abortions. And what we need is, one, the FDA to rule that we don't need prescriptions for them. Only one of the two pills needs a prescription under federal law, but the FDA has already found through research that this product is far safer than most over-the-counter drugs already. And it should not have to be in this complicated federal oversight process for prescriptions for the pills. And if these pills become over the counter, surely they will be more easily accessible by women in the red states. Now, there's still complications there because you want to make sure that even if you're not going to be with a doctor or healthcare provider when you're taking the medication, that you have been correctly counseled. You have to have a blood test to make sure you're not beyond X number of weeks pregnant. You have to make sure you don't have certain physical attributes that make this not an option for you, allergies, etc. But in theory, we believe that would make it much easier for women in these anti-choice states to make private decisions. But then I believe it was Louisiana today that signed a bill saying, and if you try to get these pills through the mail, we're going to make that a felony also. So it's, again, the whack-a-mole theory that no matter what good idea you might come up with, some other crazy legislator has decided we're going to outlaw that also. So, it's not a perfect plan, but people are going to be getting these pills. They're going to be using these pills. And as far as I'm concerned, our job is to try to make sure that they are actual correct pills or the right medicine, and that they have gotten the information about how they have to have the blood test to confirm how pregnant they are so that they're not walking themselves into a risky situation.
So I would just add two things. Missouri has, as you might expect, has tightly regulated medication abortion. And so that was actually the impetus for opening the clinic in Illinois to allow people to go there without having to undergo 2 doctor's visits and a long waiting period between informed consent and the administration of the first pill. So I agree that the solution should be federal, because individual states that regulate abortion are going to include medication abortion. The second point is that a legal scholar has studied the use of medication abortion in other countries that have tightly regulated it, and it doesn't stop people from getting it through the mails from a variety of sources. And the problem is that when, in the rare case where the patient has complications and has to present at a hospital, then the authorities have to report that person for having had an abortion. And in those countries where the patient can be subjected to criminal prosecution, it falls on women who present themselves at public hospitals. Wealthier women get to go to private doctors who do a better job of shielding their confidentiality.
Right.
Thank you. And can we now unmute? Lori has another question, I believe.
No, actually, it's just I just wanted to make a comment that this is all about control. This is all about men wanting to control, men and Catholics, I guess, celibate men wanting to control women's bodies. That's really what it's all about. And we all need to be cognizant of that. That's it. That's all I wanted to say.
So I wanted to ask a question about funding. It had come to my attention that there were bills in Albany this session that would provide funding for women to come to New York who were lower income if they could not get a safe abortion in their home state. But I don't know what happened to those discussions about funding. And I thought Ms. Kruger or Ms. Seawright could address that for us.
Rebecca, you want to take that first?
Yeah, if I remember correctly, I think it was Jessica Gonzalez Rojas that had that bill. And when we conferenced it in the assembly, I believe leadership didn't advance it because the governor had already set aside, I don't know, maybe Liz, the dollar amount. And so they felt the bill wasn't necessary because the governor had already set aside certain number
35 million, I think. So the governor put $25 million additional into abortion services and 10 million for increased security at abortion providers. But I actually think that the bill that Peggy's referencing, it was not necessarily money for the abortion services. It was to support travel and costs for women coming to New York to get abortions, and hotel costs, etc. And I support the bill, but I want to make it really clear to everyone here. There's nothing in New York state law that says you can't give money to an organization to do exactly that. And this bill wasn't going to be state money. It was going to be a tax checkoff box on your tax return. So I don't know how many people sit and stare at the last page of their New York state tax return each year, but if you do, you'll see there's about 30 different checks offs that you can mark, give $50 here, give $50 there, and you can sort of do your non-for-profit giving through your tax return. So I believe this bill was specifically to add into the category for services for women coming for abortion, which I think is fine, but I think there's some little confusion. Somehow people think without that law, they can't just do that. They can take their own private money and philanthropically give it to quite a number of very well-known and respected organizations who will use it for exactly the purpose you hope your money will be spent for. And the truth about the tax checkoff, they never raise very much money because people don't think about philanthropy as they're doing their taxes. They think about how angry they are at government that their taxes are too high. So it's not actually the perfect match of discussion, even though I think it's just fine to make it available as an option. So I don't know whether they will come back with the same bill next year. I do think it's important to remember that in New York State, right, if you're low income, even if you're not a resident of New York State or a legal citizen of this country, and you go for health care and you don't have insurance and you can't afford it, we're going to take care of it through any number of different programs we operate. So it's, now I don't know if I'll be able to say that in 3 years if this country continues to go down the tubes and 1 million women a year are coming across the border to New York. But we even have state Medicaid funded abortion in New York. We can't use federal money, but we use state money through the Medicaid program to pay for abortion. We use a variety of funding streams for people with no insurance access for all kinds of medical care, because I like to think of it as because we believe in that kind of thing here in New York, because we're going down the right path in life. And so it was really the money to help make sure people could get here and stay here if they needed to stay here for several days in order to complete their healthcare services. And again, anybody who's interested in, Dawn from my office is here on the Zoom. Thank you, Dawn, for raising your hand. And Dawn is my walking encyclopedia on all things reproductive health and many other things, by the way, if you've ever needed health policy help from my office. And we can certainly get people lists of well-known and respected groups who are using money to do exactly these things.
Well, let me ask, so that 25 million of the 35 million that's been allocated for abortion services, that 25 million is largely meant for helping people come to New York if they can't get an abortion elsewhere?
No, it is intended to allow our providers to expand, recognizing that they've already been underfunded and in certain parts of the state really at a disadvantage, more in upstate New York than here in New York City, but that we know the demand for their services will be growing, and we want to make sure that they have funds available to expand their sites, their facilities, and their providers. But we specifically didn't put in language, you can only use this money for an out-of-state refugee coming here, because there are plenty of poor women in New York State who also have trouble getting access when they need it somewhere near where they live. Because again, if you travel upstate New York, you can be in counties that are surrounded by other counties, hours and hours away from anywhere but, frankly, a Catholic hospital. The Catholic hospitals dominate in upstate New York, and because of their religious beliefs, and I'm not saying that they have to change their religious beliefs, those are their right. But the problem is they don't provide contraception or reproductive health services. So you have to make sure, as the state of New York, that you are going the extra mile to make sure that you have those services accessible, particularly in these more rural, far, far away areas. We also know that the Pennsylvania border is going to be an obvious place, just like you're hearing from Dr. Appleton about the difference between Illinois and Missouri. There's this nice big border there. Like there's no wall, right? Or river. You just cross it to go to a different state. So Pennsylvania is an anti-choice state, or is likely to end up an anti-choice state. And New York's border with Pennsylvania is damn big. And it's in a whole stretch of area that is very rural, mostly Catholic hospitals on both sides of the border. And we know we're going to need to deal with more people coming across. We're told we're already seeing more people coming across state lines for help. And again, the court case isn't done yet.
And I just wanted to point out that 10 million of the 35 million was earmarked to protect abortion clinics.
Yes.
Yeah, but if you are a woman needing to come to New York who is low income, how would you get funds from New York? Who would you turn to get the funding?
So you're not going to get it from the state of New York. I don't think any state is likely to fund that. But again, you're probably very likely to go to whatever provider groups were actually offering these services before they couldn't legally, and say, okay, I can get birth control here, but I can get treated for STDs here, but I can't get at the end of a pregnancy here. What do you recommend? And I think those providers will be exactly the people to be saying, okay, there's this fund that we can get you money for train, plane, hotel, and hopefully, and this is where you walk into those legal questions from the earlier discussion, they can pick up the phone in Texas, or not Texas, another not as insane state, pick one. They could pick up the phone and call New York and say, we're going to send this person to you for services because we can't provide these services in our state, but we want to make sure they get taken care of, so that you will have a provider / advocate in your home state helping you to maneuver the system as best you can and to get you to the location that you need to be. And maybe it will be New York, or maybe it will be another state, or maybe there'll be unique circumstances where they know you really need X type of service. And hopefully it will never be women just wandering around in the dark, ending up with, horrible things happening, as we know they did before we had legal abortion in this country.
Thanks very much. Vanessa, could you unmute Vanessa, please?
Hi, thanks. And I apologize. I did switch devices, so I'm sorry if this right when Dr. Appleton was answering Alita's question. So I apologize if you did explicitly answer this and I just missed it. But on that, on the same note, I believe Alita's question had one question about if you are part of that organization or directly using your own money to help an out-of-state individual come to New York to get abortion services, could you be legally liable in the state where aiding and abetting abortion is outlawed?
So it might depend on where you do your aiding and abetting. So if someone is in a hostile state and asks a local provider for a referral, could that be considered aiding and abetting? Or is that protected by the First Amendment because it's speech? So that those are some of the unanswered questions. But we would imagine that some of the aiding would take place in the very state that is trying to prevent its local residents from terminating their pregnancies. As I pointed out on one of my slides, though, what has happened in Illinois is there's this regional logistics center, and all the phones are based there, the computers are based there, and the idea is that if people can somehow work with that center, that's safer than working with, say, providers across the river in Missouri.
Okay.
But again, these are some of the unanswered questions about what is the extent of a state's authority and what constitutional limits might restrict that authority.
Do you, sorry, this might just be the same answer though. Do you have any thoughts about specifically funding? I'm working with one of those organizations that's looking to come up with, to find a fund, a safe haven fund, and it's a concern of donors.
Well, so in the campaign finance world of the Supreme Court, money is speech, which actually can be a good thing.
Yeah.
Then funding turns out to be protected by the First Amendment. Now, whether or not that doctrine extends to this area is an open question. But even in my very hostile state of Missouri, there is a fund established.
Great.
So we'll have to see what happens to that, because we don't have the Supreme Court's opinion yet, and therefore we don't know what further steps all of these hostile states will take.
Thank you.
And Vanessa, if I could just add also, and again, we still all don't know, but if you go to your medical provider for advice and referral, they are under federal HIPAA law, which supersedes most state laws for privacy and confidentiality of medical information. So again, nobody's tested it yet to see what happens if one of the crazy states sends their police in demanding, the records of all patients that were spoken to. But federal law in theory supersedes state law on healthcare privacy because of HIPAA. And some people think that that may be an extra layer of protection, at least not for actually performing illegal activities in the state, but for having confidential private conversations between a healthcare provider and their patient.
Very interesting.
Not tested yet.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting.
I believe Avril has a question, and we haven't heard from her yet. Could you unmute her, please?
Hi, am I unmuted?
Yes.
You are.
Hi, I'm in Connecticut, but I know Peggy and a few other people in New York City, and I used to live there. Just a question. I'm in Connecticut, although I'm not right now. I'm in New Hampshire, lights going out. But if I'm in Connecticut, just a question. I was thinking of the Ukrainian refugees and how they've been housed in Poland. And everyone, I'm in a private family foundation, and I can give money to that and Planned Parenthood and all these funds that they're setting up to help people that people have referred to. But legally, if I'm in Connecticut and I want to help, say, someone from Missouri or Texas go to New York for an abortion, what happens to me? I mean, in my house, like not just giving money is free speech, but in my house, if I put them up and I say, oh, I'm being a nice neighbor or whatever, Samaritan, legally, maybe religiously, whatever I want to do. Legally, I was just sort of curious that women, the frustration I have is I'm always near New York. I was hear a lot about New York, but how do we work state to state? And so to me, I know Dr. Appleton's talked about it. I heard, I took a few snapshots like the Constitution and all these different things, but, you kind of wonder how you can help personally, not just money or legally.
So it does really vary state by state, but Dawn, we worked with that really smart legislator in Connecticut. Remind me of the name. Oh, you're on mute. You can't help me. Sorry. Okay, can you ask?
I was going to say one
I'm
smart
sorry.
guy we have is Chris Murphy, but that's the gun thing. So, Sandy.
It was a different legislator who's working on some language, and we were comparing notes with him on different language of different state bills. So I would actually, cross-check with the Connecticut laws, because Connecticut seems to be on the edge of doing all the right things also. So you might not actually have to move the woman across state lines to New York. They might be able to get their services in Connecticut. And again, some of the laws we were trying to work are things that, no, they're not going to be able to show up at your house from another state and drag you or your guest away, because we're not allowing extradition. We're not allowing coordination between our police and sheriffs from those states. So I do think that if you're in a state that is going down the path as New York has, and I know that Connecticut is going down, in California, Maryland, Massachusetts, Illinois, we've all been working and trying to coordinate together on our laws, that it should be okay. There's a lot of gray area there in states that haven't passed anything really going one direction or another. And I think we have to, one, make sure who you vote for and who you get into office in all these other gray area states. And then just keep pushing on legislatures to go the right way, not the wrong way.
Senator Kruger, it's Representative Blumenthal. That's the.
Thank you. From Connecticut, but not the U.S. Senator Blumenthal, in the Connecticut State Legislature?
Correct.
Thank you. Okay. Because there are a couple of Blumenthals from Connecticut. Thank you.
Erica, I believe you had another question.
Actually, it was just to offer some resources. I'm on the social justice, I'm a community member on the social justice committee, and I can send Will some resources from groups that I've participated with. One of the big ones is, and let me just look really quickly to make sure it's not .com. Yeah, it's called ineedana.com. And it provides all kinds of resources to help people get an abortion. There's also a list that I can share of all of the state funds in one place. So Will, is that okay if I send that to you?
Absolutely. That would be great, Erica. We really appreciate it.
Yes, and Will, could you send it to Gail and me so that we can put it in the minutes? Thank you.
Happy to do it.
Thank you, Erica. That would be wonderful.
You're welcome.
And I believe Valerie has something to add.
Hi, I just wanted to, on your point about the giving of the money, protected speech. I mean, your speech is not protected if it's in the form of a criminal act. And so you have to be careful, I think, on the aiding and abetting practice. I mean, and that could be like one of the first things, because, national abortion rights or Planned Parenthood has the C4 versus the C3, right? So you can give the money to the C3 and deduct it, which is the operating funds. And then if you do the lobby, you have no right to deduct it. But I think if you are giving money to the operations, and these organizations are now in restricted states, that may be the first people that they go after, because they want those funds to dry up. And so you could be, you could be subject to conspiracy to commit murder, conspiracy to, do all sorts of things. So again, I think it's going to be very interesting. My other question was, just from a point of view, is just to sort of, what do we do in New York in terms of free, we're talking about contraception. What about free pregnancy tests and free, what are we doing for young women in schools, et cetera, who as I said before, the problems start to happen when the abortions start late. So how do we get people to realize that they're pregnant in a very confidential way? I just don't know. I don't have a daughter, and I don't know what is available in school right now. And, again, a couple of years ago, there were more young men who were happy that abortions were around and fighting for abortion rights than young women, because they saw the issue for themselves. So I'm just wondering, what does New York State do to support, again, young women who don't have a lot of money and poor women?
So the good news for New York, I didn't want to correct you before, but actually our rate of abortion has been going down for years. Yeah. Because women are getting access to contraception, and young women are getting access to contraception, and young men. So surely we all know that there are free condoms in New York City everywhere, and you can get them through the Department of Health and have them delivered to your office. I used to put them out in the reception area. Some people thought they were hand sanitizers, but they were condoms in lovely subway pattern packets. Planned Parenthood, if you walk into a Planned Parenthood or equivalent center anywhere in New York and you don't have any kind of insurance and you don't have any money to pay, those services are free. In New York City, we have not enough, but we have actually school-based health centers, and in middle schools and high schools, and they focus a lot on contraception and counseling and services related to reproductive health. And truthfully, what this whole state or country needs, but it's a much longer conversation that I'm not going to start tonight, is comprehensive sex ed that's age appropriate, starting at the youngest ages, including on issues of what's good touching and what's not okay touching. And we need to have that as part of the school curriculums, I believe, in every school in our state. You get into unfunded mandates, you get into school boards getting hysterical in parts of the state, you get into parental right to remove their child from this kind of education. So very complicated, but also in countries where they have comprehensive sex ed, they also have a much lower rate of unwanted pregnancies for young people. Yeah. That is really a win. So
I completely agree with that. I mean, I think that was ever since abortion has been legal, the number has been coming down. I'm just wondering now if New York State is going to put all this money towards, helping women. Are we going to keep statistics, although anonymously, about how many women are actually coming from other states? Because I also think that would be helpful to the argument that there are women all across this country who want and need this service. And, it's not just New Yorkers who are getting abortions in New York. How many people actually come here to support the argument that it is happening everywhere? I mean, a lot of people don't realize, they don't realize it.
And I don't know the answer, and I'm hesitant to say that I have the right answer, Valerie, because one thing we are very conscious of, we don't want to be collecting data that's identifiable, right, that could be hacked or mega taken and then transferred to a state that is looking through to find, why were my citizens in New York City at Planned Parenthood on X date and time? So I am sure there are ways to collect data that's not individual identified, but I can't tell you that I know that Department of Health is already set up to track that based on state of residency. I just don't know.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eric. I'm sorry.
I just wanted to add, Julia Richmond High School over here on First Avenue and 68th has a health clinic, and the woman doctor in charge, she comes to Albany every session and lobbies for additional dollars. So one thing we can do is put more grant money in our CBOs, our community-based organizations targeted toward young women.
Good idea.
Thank you. Erica, did you have another point you wanted to make?
No.
Okay. Valerie, did you have something else to make? Okay. So I think that concludes the questions we had. Did anybody in the committee want to make a resolution or say something else or or are we fine here?
I know I actually have to leave, so
Yeah.
if that's okay.
I do too.
You may have your resolution, and I will thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for spending
Thank
so
you
much
all
time
for
with us.
attending. Appreciate it.
Thank
I
you.
have to go as well, but thank you for inviting me, and it's really stimulating conversation.
You've been
It's
wonderful.
a
and thank
pleasure
you
to
very
have
much.
you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
So Gail, did you want to make a motion to adjourn or?
I will move to adjourn. Is there a second? And thank you all for attending. It's really been a stimulating and fascinating conversation, and hopefully we'll see progress moving forward.
Right.
Have a
Thank
good
you
evening,
very much.
everyone.
And
Thank you.
have a good evening.